Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kirk, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 13 wide receiver rankings for the 2022 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, we're going to be covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses thus far this season, on average, between weeks 7 through 12, have been giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers in a half PPR scoring format, meeting everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard league or a full PPR league, giving you guys a little bit more perspective and information in regards to which of these wide receivers we have to play due to matchup, and which we might want to avoid because the cornerback coverage is just a little too much on a weekly basis. After we talk about matchups, we'll then transition into talking about our top 36 wide receiver rankings. I'll of course talk about them each individually, giving you guys my opinion and the statistics that justify the reasons as to why I want to play these specific wide receivers at their current ranking. Now, of course, as I progress throughout today's video, we'll also be mentioning a couple prize pick entries in relation to some of these wide receivers, whether it's reception total and or receiving yards, picking more or less on those given statistics. If you guys haven't checked out prize picks, you can go ahead and do so today. There's a link down in the description. Sign up using promo code ANSWER today. And when you do so and make a first-time deposit, your first-time deposit is immediately doubled up to $100. So check that out today. Thank you very much. Also, before we begin, even though I'm talking about my top 36 wide receiver rankings, understand that the rankings are always subject to change. As the week progresses, as players, deal with injuries, miss practice, rankings are going to fluctuate up and down the list, whether it's tomorrow, whether it's by Sunday morning. So if you want to stay up to date on my latest content, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content. Of course, on the weekend, Saturday and Sunday, we, of course, have 2-hour live streams, both on Saturday and Sunday, for the singular purpose of answering your questions, get your lineup set, and of course, helping you win your Week 13 matchups. And of course, by the end of the season, helping you try to win a 2022 Fantasy Football Championship. So be sure to subscribe. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about our Week 13 wide receivers, beginning with matchups. As you can see to the right of me, over the course of the last 6 weeks, weeks 7 through 12, we have found that the Minnesota Vikings are giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers over the course of that span of time. Now, the fact of the matter is they've given up a boatload of touchdowns, and that is one of the primary reasons as to why they're giving up so many fantasy points. But again, they've also been targeted the most amongst all of these defenses. Opposing offensive coordinators know that when you play against the Minnesota Vikings, you're going to throw the ball heavily. And even in that game a couple weeks ago against the Dallas Cowboys, where, quite frankly, they didn't have to throw the ball much, they still found success. The Minnesota Vikings are obviously a matchup we want to take advantage of going into this week. Mike White, the Jets receivers, could definitely go ahead and deliver for us. The Buffalo Bills, of course, have given up their fair share of points to opposing wide receivers. Mac Jones on Thursday night. Hopefully, Jakobi Meyers is healthy. We have DeVante Parker. Nelson Agholor had himself a big performance last week. They could immediately transition into a great matchup here and put up great points in terms of the passing game. The Detroit Lions, San Francisco 49ers, Arizona Cardinals, all a bunch of matchups we absolutely need to take advantage of. While on the other end of the spectrum, we of course have the New York Jets, who are giving up the fewest amount of points to opposing wide receivers. Doesn't bode well, potentially for Justin Jefferson, but we know that he is an elite wide receiver, and regardless of who is covering him, that being Sauce Gardner this week, we should expect to see a lot of success from him. The Indianapolis Colts, New England Patriots, Commanders, and of course the Saints also follow. And this includes the Saints without Marshawn Lattimore for the last, 7 weeks here? Mike Evans might have some troubles this week if, in fact, Marshawn Lattimore is active, but we'll talk about that in just a moment as we go throughout today's video. Again, we'll refer back to these statistics over the course of today's video in regards to specific players and whether or not their matchups are going to impact their overall play. Outside of that, let's transition and begin our top 36 wide receiver rankings for Week 13 of the 2022 fantasy football season. Beginning with our number 1, we have Stefon Diggs. Stefon Diggs is in a position that he takes on the New England Patriots, which, of course, we know they have a pretty good secondary, but just this last week, Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen both went off against them. Both had 9 receptions in that game and were great overall receiving options because they both also found the end zone. In my opinion, when we look at Stefon Diggs, we know that it doesn't matter what the matchup is. The potential for his overall upside is just way too high to ignore. Now, when we look at last week's performance on Thursday night, Thanksgiving Day against the Detroit Lions, obviously it was a fantastic matchup, but he was quite early in that game. When they needed him most, he stepped up and he was absolutely clutch. In the last 9 passing attempts that Josh Allen had, 6 of them went in the direction of, Stefon Diggs. And what did he do? He won the game with those receptions, not only with the touchdown, but also got them in the field goal range to clutch the game up with Tyler Bass. Overall, we know that Stefon Diggs is the best wide receiver in fantasy right now in a half PPR scoring format, and you'll continue to be as such. The other statistic I wanted to mention before we move on, because of course they play tomorrow on Thursday, is the fact that Josh Allen in the last 2 games that he's taken on the New England Patriots defense, he has thrown for 622 passing yards and 8 passing touchdowns. Should be a pretty good week for him going into Week 13. Moving on to Davante Adams, our number 2. Davante Adams, again, another clutch wide receiver that is making plays every single week. Unfortunately, this last week wasn't able to continue a streak of over 120 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown, but we may be able to get back on track here up against the Los Angeles Chargers. And the primary reason why I think it's definitely in the realm of possibility is because in week 1, when the Las Vegas Raiders took on the Chargers, Davante Adams had a monster game of 17 total targets that led to 10 receptions, 141 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown for 25.1 fantasy points. If he's able to duplicate anything even similar to those numbers, we're going to find ourselves a fantastic week once again for Davante Adams, who has been within the top 3 conversation for quite some time now at the wide receiver position, considering really there's no one else to throw the ball to within that offense. Of course, Mac Hollins and Foster Moreau will, pop up here and there, but as long as Derek Carr continues to look in the direction of Davante Adams 10 or more times per game, he's going to find success. The one stat that I wanted to mention before we move on in regards to him is that DeAndre Hopkins up against the Los Angeles Chargers secondary last week, he did have himself a fantastic week. Found the end zone, was incredible. But that was the first time a wide receiver had scored a touchdown against this secondary since week 7. So, of course, the secondary has played a lot better as of late, but we know that the elite level talent of Adams will definitely surpass that. It's not a big deal. Moving on. Let's talk about Tyreek Hill. Speaking of elite level talent, even though Tyreek Hill didn't have an incredible, massive 20-point performance up against the Houston Texans, it wasn't really expected because the score at halftime was 30-0. And when that's the case, and Tyreek Hill's dealing with a couple cramp situations, got hit hard over the middle because Tua's pass, float a little bit long. But either way, had himself a decent performance. 9 targets, 6 catches, 85 yards. If you're able to do that in the first half of a game and can just continue to build upon that into a second half, should be good. Specifically, going up against the San Francisco 49ers, who are giving up top 5 numbers in terms of opposing wide receivers over the course of the last 6 weeks here. The San Francisco 49ers secondary is going to have their hands full because not only do they have to worry about Tyreek Hill, but on the other side of the field, they have to deal with Jaylen Waddle. So at this current moment in time, a defense like the San Francisco 49ers, who are currently in the top 2 conversation in terms of run-stopping defenses, is obviously going to force Tua and, of course, these receivers to step up and obviously win them the game this week. I'm expecting Tyreek Hill to have himself a massive performance and hopefully find the end zone. Moving on to Justin Jefferson. Yes, another week in which he has a difficult matchup. And we talked about it last week. The matchup could end up being a factor in his overall production because he had went from playing against, Stefon Diggs not playing well, then going up against the New England cornerbacks, which he obviously dominated up against. 11 targets, 9 catches, 139, and a touchdown. An incredible performance. And now he has Sauce Gardner this week. Obviously, it's going to be a test. But going into this week, I'm not too worried about the potential of Justin Jefferson as long as he's able to eclipse a certain number. He needs to get himself over 10 targets in this given game. Thus far this season, in the 7 games that he has had 10 or more targets, he has had 6 of those games consist of 22 or more fantasy points. Opportunity leads to success in fantasy football. And when we're talking about elite level talent at the wide receiver position, specifically Justin Jefferson, I don't care who's guarding him. As long as the opportunity is there and Kirk Cousins is not afraid of the challenge at hand with the young rookie cornerback, we should be in a perfect position to succeed. As of this current moment in time, I'm expecting Justin Jefferson, who is leading the wide receiver position in terms of yards after the catch, only ahead of Cooper Kupp by just a little bit of yards, obviously because Cooper Kupp has been missing, but still the number 1 at the position. After you get the ball in his hands, he's a dynamic playmaker, and of course, we expect him to continue that for the remainder of the season. Moving on to our number 5, we have A.J. Brown. I'm expecting this revenge game to be pretty big for A.J. Brown, taking on his former team, the Tennessee Titans. Now, last week, even though A.J. Brown had himself 10.6 fantasy points, found the end zone, was a great overall play, a thing that I want to mention to you guys is that he was sick for majority of that week, and even after the game, he had told the media in specific that he had lost 7 pounds that week, and obviously wasn't feeling well throughout the entirety of that game, yet was able to battle through it and play well. Hopefully, that's past him because he's going to need a full strength going up against the Tennessee Titans, which of course have struggled heavily in terms of stopping opposing wide receivers, and that's exactly what Jalen Hurts and A.J. Brown are going to focus on. If in fact we're in a situation here, considering the recent performances of wide receivers up against the Tennessee Titans, of course, we just saw T. Higgins, 7 catches, 114 and a touchdown. Watson from the Packers, 4 catches, 48, 2 touchdowns. JuJu Smith-Schuster, 10 catches, 88. If we're going to be in a situation where the running game kind of fizzles out because of how good Tennessee is in terms of stopping the run, which, quite frankly, I still think that the Philadelphia Eagles offensive line will be able to handle themselves. We're going to be looking in the direction of A.J. Brown often, and I'm sure everyone in that building knows that he wants a little bit of payback to prove to them that they should have paid him. They should have kept him instead of trading him, but either way, he's in a good position this week. Moving on to CeeDee Lamb, our number 6. CeeDee Lamb, again, another big week here. 10-plus targets, found himself fantasy production, should have had himself a touchdown. Unfortunately, his toe is down on his second foot, and then as that play was happening, his heel lands out of bounds. I don't know what is defined as a reception. I feel like that should have been a touchdown, considering all things. Either way, 6 points taken away, actually more, probably 8 points taken away from his overall production within the given week. Obviously would have made him a top 3, fantasy option. But either way, as long as Dak Prescott continues to look in the direction of CeeDee Lamb, he's in a fantastic position. He goes up against the Indianapolis Colts secondary, which of course have been good all season long. Gilmore, Rogers, Kenny Moore, doesn't matter. They've got great cornerbacks across the board. It's just a matter of whether or not we're going to see the targets funnel in the direction of CeeDee Lamb. We did see a lot of utilization from Michael Gallup last week, which is great. As long as Michael Gallup can pull his own coverage, is going to make it that much more of an easy process for CeeDee Lamb to find himself open. Should be a great play this week going up against Indy. Moving on, let's talk about Amon-Ra St. Brown. Amon-Ra St. Brown over the last 5 weeks has collected 10, 9, 11, 8, and 10 targets. That level of target opportunity is him commanding 31.58% of the total target share within this offense with Jared Goff. If about 32% of the total passing attempts are going in the direction of Amon-Ra St. Brown, it's not a surprise that he's finding as much success as he has. Now he's going up against the Jacksonville Jaguars, which honestly should have lost that game. The amount of drop touchdowns that Baltimore Ravens receiving options, whether it was Oliver, whether it was Andrews, whether it was Demarcus Robinson had in that game, obviously led them down the path of potentially losing that game. But in my mind, I'm looking at Amon-Ra St. Brown thinking to myself, he's the primary number one. And if he continues to get those targets filtered in his direction, it's going to be difficult for any defense to stop him on a weekly basis. Moving on to Jaylen Waddle on number 8. Jaylen Waddle, of course, is pretty much neck and neck with Tyreek Hill. Like I mentioned last week, the difference between Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle in a half PPR scoring format, when Tua has been the starter on the field and has not left the game early with an injury, has been about 3 fantasy points separating the two of them. So we're in a conversation here where, of course, last week, Jaylen Waddle finishes with 11 fantasy points. Tyreek Hill finishes with 12 fantasy points. They're neck and neck. Identical receiving yards, 85 a pop. One had 6 receptions, the other had 5. We're in a conversation where we could see very similar, identical production, especially going up against the San Francisco 49ers, like I mentioned a couple moments ago, are one of the best run-stopping defenses in the National Football League thus far this season, and have quite frankly nullified all running backs that they have come up against. I mean, Alvin Kamara even fumbled twice last week against them, which definitely was the struggling point. But across the board, when we look at the fact that the San Francisco 49ers, thus far this season, over the course of the last 6 weeks, are giving up the 4th most points to opposing wide receivers, this is an advantageous matchup that we're certainly going to see Jaylen Waddle and Tyreek Hill take advantage of. Of course, his fantasy production from last week often had to do with the fact that they were up 30-0 really quickly, and a couple defensive touchdowns is all you need. So at this moment in time, I'm expecting Jaylen Waddle to have himself a great week. Via PrizePicks this week, his current number is 75.5 receiving yards. He has surpassed that number in 4 out of the last 5 games, and I think he'll be able to do that once again this week. Moving on to T. Higgins. All right, T. Higgins, you're coming off of back-to-back fantasy weeks of over 19 fantasy points. He's combined those 2 weeks for 40-plus fantasy points, and now there is a conversation where he's going up against the number 2 cornerback of the Kansas City Chiefs, because we will probably have Ja'Marr Chase back. And, while I'm on the topic, let's just talk about both these wide receivers. Both T. Higgins and Ja'Marr Chase are my number 9 and number 10 going into the given week. So specifically in regards to T. Higgins, he's coming off of incredible performances even without Ja'Marr Chase on the field. And with Ja'Marr Chase on the field back again, it's probably going to pull a lot of coverage in his direction and allow T. Higgins to continue to be a viable option in fantasy. Now, in the last 2 games that he's taken on the Kansas City Chiefs, in one of those games, it was Ja'Marr Chase all day. In the other, specifically in the playoffs, most recently, 6 receptions for over 100 receiving yards. A great game. We're expecting very similar production in a high-scoring event between these two teams. Now, when we move on to the next conversation in regards to Ja'Marr Chase, again, he has found himself a lot of success against this organization. You go back to week 17 of the 2021 year, he had himself 11 receptions, 266 receiving yards, and 3 receiving touchdowns in a singular game against the Kansas City Chiefs. He followed that up in the playoffs by having himself 6 catches, 54, and a touchdown against the Chiefs later that season, and of course, elevated his team to the Super Bowl because of that performance. Overall, I'm expecting Ja'Marr Chase to be back and ready to go. Last week, practiced for the entirety of the week, and they only held him out because they didn't want to, potentially risk re-injury. They want him to make impactful performances for the remainder of the season in a team that definitely has playoff and Super Bowl aspirations. I'm expecting these two teams to fire at will back and forth one another, and Ja'Marr Chase to also have himself another great week. Moving on, let's talk about Chris Godwin at number 11. Chris Godwin is in a position where, again, in the last 6 games, has had 12, 13, 11, 10, 8, and 13 targets. Those numbers are unbelievable. And quite frankly, we're beginning to see the Chris Godwin of last year. His injury, his ACL injury, is almost a year, out. And the fact of the matter is, we're beginning to see more and more of the Chris Godwin of old. where he's catching the ball, making plays after the catch, and of course, most recently, scoring. Finding himself in the end zone is very uncommon for Chris Godwin, but the fact that he has scored in each of the last 2 weeks is huge for his overall fantasy value. Now, going into this week, the expectation is that Marshon Lattimore will return for the New Orleans Saints. And usually when Marshon Lattimore is on the field, that causes a lot of problems for Mike Evans. And quite frankly, Mike Evans throughout his career, which we'll talk about in a moment in isolation with Mike Evans, has struggled mightily when Marshon Lattimore is there, whether he's getting himself suspended or barely scoring over 6 points in majority of the games against them over the course of his career. Either way, I expect Chris Godwin to have himself another massive week against the defense that certainly can give up some points to opposing slot wide receivers. Moving on, let's talk about Amari Cooper to close out the wide receiver one conversation. With Deshaun Watson returning, there is going to be a little bit of an acclimation period as to whether or not Deshaun Watson and Amari Cooper have that synergy just yet. Of course, Deshaun Watson has been practicing for the last couple weeks, getting first team reps, but it doesn't mean that they're going to have a good enough connection in comparison to what Jakobi Brissett has put together with Amari Cooper. And quite frankly, like we've seen over the course of the first 12 weeks of the season, when Jakobi Brissett heavily targets Amari Cooper, he's always going to find success. And hopefully Deshaun Watson won't be scared to do so. Based on the statistics that I've gathered over the last couple years of Deshaun Watson's career, he always likes to funnel target singular receivers. If you go back from 2017 through 2019, in the 38 games that he played with DeAndre Hopkins was averaging 16.28 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. 2017 through 2020, with Will Fuller, in the 31 games that Will Fuller played, he was averaging 20.25 fantasy points per game. Now, even when you go to 2020, after Will Fuller got suspended, Brandon Cooks from weeks 5 through 17, in the 11 games that he played with Deshaun Watson, was averaging 15.7 fantasy points per game. I understand it was a different offense. I understand that he was active in playing, and he wasn't coming off of a huge year of a gap, and then, of course, the 11-game suspension in a completely different offense. There's going to be an acclimation period, but I think he knows full well who to send the ball in the direction of. And going up against his former team, there should be a lot of potential for Amari Cooper to have himself success this week. Moving on to Christian Kirk, our number 13. Look, Christian Kirk did not have himself a great week, but he did see himself 9 targets once again. The target counts are going to continue to be there. And the biggest difference maker in terms of what we're going to see from Christian Kirk, considering he has been inconsistent throughout the season thus far. I mean, again, he only has 6 performances of 10 or more fantasy points, and he has 5 performances of less than 10 fantasy points. So the inconsistency is certainly there, but it mainly has to do with touchdowns. Christian Kirk has the 3rd most touchdowns amongst all wide receivers thus far this season. He has 7 total. If we're going to witness another week in which Christian Kirk finds the end zone, then of course he's going to have himself a massive performance up against the Detroit Lions secondary, who are giving up a boatload of points to opposing wide receivers since week 7. In fact, almost 34 fantasy points per week. So there's a lot of room for Christian Kirk and Zay Jones and even Marvin Jones Jr. to find success in said matchup. That all being said, most recently, the Detroit Lions have struggled mightily against slot receiving options. Isaiah McKenzie, 6 catches, 96 and a touchdown. Wan'Dale Robinson, 9 catches for 100. In that same game, Richie James Jr. came in after Wan'Dale Robinson left with an injury, 3 catches, 48 and a touchdown. We know that Christian Kirk this season has played 77+% of his offensive snaps from the slot position. Should be an incredible week for him. Going into this week via PrizePicks, his current number is 60.5 receiving yards. There is a lot of room for him to easily surpass that number, if not dominate and double that up. I think it's an automatic play alongside Jaylen Waddle's potential entry going into the week. Moving on to DK Metcalf for number 14. DK Metcalf has been one of the most consistent wide receivers over the course of the last couple weeks here. I mean, when we just isolate his numbers from week 7 through 12, so just the last 6 weeks, his overall fantasy point contributions, 14.5, 14.5, 12.2, 10.1, 1.7. Obviously, the 1.7 point week, injured. So outside of that, he is a 10+ point fantasy point contributor on a weekly basis. Obviously, because of the contributions of Geno Smith and Tyler Lockett on the opposite side of the field finding success. And as long as that running game continues to find their own success, DK Metcalf will find himself open as one of the most elite wide receivers in the National Football League. Now, unfortunately, he doesn't have ultimate upside like some of these other receiving options where he can catch 150 yards in a game and go for 2 touchdowns. But it's not out of the realm of possibility. That being said, they do take on the Los Angeles Rams. Their defense is falling apart. We already know that Matthew Stafford and Aaron Donald are not going to be active in this game. And last season, when we saw DK Metcalf take on this defense, we obviously saw a lot of, Jalen Ramsey. But that doesn't scare me because even in those matchups, we saw DK Metcalf find great performances. In the first one, 5 catches, 98 yards, 2 touchdowns. In the other game, 6 catches for 52, but he had 12 targets. Obviously, if half those targets are going to waste, I think Geno Smith could definitely elevate him in this conversation and have himself another big week here in week 13. Moving on, let's talk about Christian Watson. You guys have known that I'm on the Christian Watson train. I'm not going to slow it down. As long as this man continues to score touchdowns, he's going to be in my lineup. There's no reason to take him out. He's coming off of his third consecutive week of scoring a touchdown, of course, and in the last 12 receptions has 6 receiving touchdowns. That in itself should pretty much automatically make him a start. Besides the fact that he takes on the Chicago Bears this week with Aaron Rodgers active and healthy, we know that the Chicago Bears defense, Eddie Jackson, their starting, safety, which again is probably their best secondary player, is out on the IR for the rest of the season. Kyler Gordon has missed time, could potentially miss again. And the rest of their secondary outside of, those two now being potentially out is in shambles. I mean, really, they have not played well all season long in terms of coverage. They have not been amongst the best in the league. I'm expecting to see a lot of production here from Christian Watson once again, with Allen Lazard obviously taking a back seat when we're talking about the touchdown conversation within this offense. Now, while we're still on the topic of Christian Watson, I do want to mention this week his current number via PrizePicks is 47.5 receiving yards. He's been able to surpass that number in each of the last 3 weeks. I expect Aaron Rodgers to let it rip against the Chicago Bears. We know the Chicago Bears can't stop the run, but eventually play action will kick in and a deep receiving threat like, Christian Watson will be able to take advantage of it. I don't believe 47.5 receiving yards is a difficult number to surpass, quite frankly, because he can do that in a singular play. Moving on. Let's talk about our number 16, Garrett Wilson, another rookie wide receiver we wanted to mention. Garrett Wilson looked great because of how well Mike White played. Even in a rain game, Mike White had almost an 80% passing completion percentage, torched that Chicago Bears defense, like we were just talking about with, Christian Watson should also be able to do the same. But either way, when we're talking about isolated Garrett Wilson going up against the Minnesota Vikings defense, quite literally the best matchup in the given week, I think Garrett Wilson at 16 is being passive. It's being safe. I want to be safe with this because scoring touchdowns is difficult to do. Sure, getting down into, the red zone is going to be a conversation for this team considering how bad the Minnesota Vikings secondary has played all season long. But it's just a matter of whether he's going to find the end zone in comparison to, his teammates, Tyler Conklin, Elijah Moore, Corey Davis, perhaps the running backs. There should always be a conversation regarding that and not guaranteeing automatic touchdown success, unless we're talking about guys who are doing it on a consistent weekly basis, like a Christian Watson. And in a moment, we'll talk about Tyler Lockett. But at this current moment in time, I'm looking at Garrett Wilson's numbers. Again, led the team in terms of total targets, led the team in terms of total receiving yards. And going into this week, where we saw New England put up 16 receptions, 243 yards, and a touchdown amongst their wide receivers. Buffalo, 23 receptions, 264 and a touchdown. Arizona wide receivers, 21 receptions, 263 and 2 touchdowns. The sky's the limit in the number 1 matchup going into the week for Garrett Wilson. And let's not forget, via PrizePicks this week, his current number is 53.5 receiving yards. Again, when you're taking on the easiest matchup and you're the number 1 receiving option of your team, I think with Garrett Wilson, Christian Watson, and Christian Kirk, the 3 numbers that I mentioned regarding them, they're all below 70 receiving yards, and I think they all will be able to very easily surpass that number going into the given week. All right, let's talk about Tyler Lockett. Speaking of touchdown consistency, Tyler Lockett has scored 4 touchdowns in the last 4 weeks, 1 per game, and is on a streak that, yes, is volatile in terms of fantasy point production, but hey, you can't be touchdown dependent if you just keep scoring touchdowns, right? It's the same conversation that we're potentially having with Zeke yesterday. If you're going to continue to be a touchdown monster, I really can't do anything but start you because you are trustworthy in that regard. Going up against the Los Angeles Rams sure has been a difficult matchup for Tyler Lockett in seasons past, but we know that the Rams are pretty much shutting down. Offensively, defensively, they're not, starting their best players because they know for a fact that they're not in the playoff contention. And with the health and the way that this season is gone, this looks like it very could easily be in the favor of the Seattle Seahawks completely blowing out the Rams. They did have a little fight in them last week against the Kansas City Chiefs. I think with their main leader, Aaron Donald out defensively with a high ankle sprain, definitely does give a lot of advantage to the Seattle Seahawks receiving options and, of course, offensive pieces as a whole. Moving on, Keenan Allen is going to be the final wide receiver within our top 18. Keenan Allen, even though he found the end zone last week, wasn't as, pivotal of a play that I thought he was going to be in regards to targets and receptions. We are beginning to see that Justin Herbert has learned to, live without his number 1 and 2 option, whether that be Mike Williams and or Keenan Allen in any order. Obviously, he's going to continue to send the ball in the direction of Austin Eckler and has become very dependent on that. I mean, he's throwing the ball to the running back position more than Drew Brees ever did when we're talking about a Joe Lombardi-led offense as the offensive coordinator. But at this current moment in time, we're expecting to see Keenan Allen find success. It's a fantastic matchup going up against the Las Vegas Raiders. And quite frankly, even with, Mike Williams questionable to play this week, with Josh Palmer out there and DeAndre Carter, I expect Keenan Allen to continue to be the number 1 in this offense, even though he was out-targeted by both those options. I expect him to get back on track. Slowly but surely, he'll eventually get into those top target numbers within this offense, considering he was the number 4 behind Eckler, of course, DeAndre Carter, and Josh Palmer this last week. Crazy numbers. Moving on, let's talk about our number 19. Beginning the second half of this conversation, we begin with Terry McLaurin. Again, if you guys have made it this far, be sure to click the like button down below and subscribe if you have not yet already. Thank you very much. All right, so here's the thing about Terry McLaurin. Takes on the New York Giants. Throughout his entire career, he has been incredible against the Giants defense. Doesn't matter who has played up against him. And Adoree Jackson, the number one cornerback for the New York Giants, is obviously going to still be dealing with an injury and most likely will be out this week. Over the course of Terry McLaurin's career against this defense, 4 catches, 93, 11 catches, 107 in a touchdown, 7 catches, 115 in a touchdown, 7 catches, 74, 7 catches, 86. Never has he put up less than 70 overall receiving yards against his defense. And quite frankly, has had himself 10 plus fantasy points in every single game against his defense in specific. In my opinion, Terry McLaurin, an automatic play in a fantastic matchup as quite literally one of the only remaining, consistent wide receivers of this offense. Outside of Terry McLaurin having 4 receptions, there was only one other reception made by a Commanders wide receiver this last weekend, which is crazy to think about. Moving on, let's talk about Mike Evans. So I want to talk about 2 potential outcomes going into this week. The first outcome is a pretty good overall fantasy production week if, in fact, Marshon Lattimore is not active. We could probably see Mike Evans get himself some yardage. Obviously, 9 targets, 2 receptions last week is unfortunate, but a lot of the plays that Mike Evans is making down the field are often getting a lot of defensive pass interference calls. So yes, his team is moving the ball, but he's not getting the receptions at the end of the day. That being said, he could probably have himself an average 10-point fantasy week at very worst. But if we're going to be in a conversation in which potentially Marshon Lattimore is active, I am probably leaning towards the idea that Mike Evans should not be started in this given week. And the reason why is that since 2019, these are the numbers that Mike Evans has put up against Marshon Lattimore in his career. 3 catches for 61 suspended in that game. 1 catch for 14. 2 catches for 48 and a touchdown. 1 catch for 3 and a touchdown. 4 catches for 64, 0 touchdown. 1 catch for 2 yards and a touchdown. 4 for 69, and then 0 for 0. He's literally only had 1 game of over 10 fantasy points over the course of the last 4 years against the New Orleans Saints defense when Marshon Lattimore has been active. And even though Mike Evans has had himself 15, 11, 6, and 9 targets in the last 5 games, if Lattimore is there, we're in trouble. If Lattimore is not there, of course, we can fire up Mike Evans once again. Moving on to Chris Olave, our number 21. Speaking of this matchup, Chris Olave should find himself success, mainly because the negative game script that we continue to see from the side of the New Orleans Saints offense. Considering this defense has not played well, and offensively, they've not been able to consistently run the ball and keep themselves in contest. And for those of you who have Alvin Kamara, you've certainly kind of experienced just how bad this offense has been, considering Alvin Kamara hasn't gotten more than 10 rushing attempts in 3 out of the last 4 games he's participated in. We're probably going to be in a situation here where Andy Dalton's going to have to air it out for a majority of that game. The last time we saw Chris Olave up against his defense, week 2, pretty much one of his breakout weeks, but not there yet with Jameis Winston. 5 total receptions for 80 total receiving yards. We could see another big game here from Chris Olave. It's just a matter of whether the targets are there. Based on last week's performance, 9 targets, 6 catches, 52 yards. I think they're definitely going to be there. It's just a matter of whether or not he can elevate his play, potentially find the end zone in this matchup. Moving on, let's talk about Brandon Aiyuk. Considering all of the injuries that are pretty much revolving Brandon Aiyuk and this offense, with Jimmy G dealing with an knee injury, we have Deebo Samuel still dealing with a quad and hamstring injury. We have Christian McCaffrey that didn't practice earlier today with his knee irritation. We have MCL, Elijah Mitchell out. There are so many injuries plaguing this defense at this current moment in time. And the fact that the Miami Dolphins are one of the better run-stopping defenses in the National Football League thus far this season over the course of the last 6 weeks, seems to me like Brandon Aiyuk, George Kittle, those are the only efficient options who are going to be consistently asked to go ahead and make plays within this given game. I'm expecting Brandon Aiyuk, especially considering Deebo Samuel is slowing down with said injury, to step up and have himself another big game here for us. Moving on. Let's talk about George Pickens going up against the Atlanta Falcons. Again, it's an advantageous matchup to say the very least. With Deontay Johnson getting a couple opportunities last week that could have ended up, Deontay Johnson scoring his first touchdown of the year, but unfortunately wasn't able to. Yet, I still believe that George Pickens is still the number 1 within this offense. When Kenny Pickett needs a play, he looks in the direction of George Pickens. And even though George Pickens wasn't able to come down with all 6 of those targets, a lot of the overall receptions that he wasn't able to make was mainly because of Kenny Pickett's inaccuracy. That all being said, considering the matchup on hand, going up against the Atlanta Falcons, which we all know we have to play our wide receivers up against, even our running backs up against, there's going to be a position here where George Pickens finds himself success. Since week 4, he's been averaging 4 receptions on 6 targets, 56 receiving yards per game, and 10.3 fantasy points per game. There's a lot of potential here. Hopefully he finds the end zone. Moving on, let's talk about DeVonta Smith. Again, with all the defenders for the Tennessee Titans, considering they know they got to lock up A.J. Brown, are going to be distracted with him, there is a potential that DeVonta Smith could have himself another big week here. Now, DeVonta Smith getting himself consistently 8, 9, 10 potential targets over the course of last month is great, but the issue as of late has been able to fulfill all of those potential targets into actualized points. Only giving 4 receptions on 9 targets isn't going to cut it. That's why he's at the bottom end of this wide receiver 2 conversation. But as of this current moment in time, again, they're taking on Tennessee. We have seen a lot of wide receivers, whether it was Higgins, whether it was Christian Watson, JuJu Smith-Schuster, McCole Hardman in these recent games, dominate up against the Tennessee Titans secondary. Hopefully, DeVonta Smith can put together a great performance this week and potentially find the end zone. Moving on to Michael Pittman Jr. Michael Pittman Jr. has been consistent. I mean, when you've seen him play with Matt Ryan this season, he is averaging 9.8 targets, 7.1 receptions, 74 receiving yards, and 0.22 touchdowns per game, which is 12.04 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. Great numbers. But this week he takes on Stefon Diggs. And let's be honest, number 1 wide receivers against Stefon Diggs have struggled this season. You go back to last week, Darius Slayton pretty much did nothing. You go back to the week before that, Justin Jefferson pretty much did nothing. There is a potential in which, even though Michael Pittman has seen a high volume of targets as of late with Matt Ryan, he could end up getting shut down. And if that's going to be the case, we might want to look elsewhere in some scenarios. But if you have to play Michael Pittman Jr., we know the targets are going to be there. They're just not all going to be actualized into automatic fantasy points, considering how difficult the matchup is on hand. Moving on, let's talk about Joshua Palmer. If in the event Mike Williams gets a full week of practice and there isn't any sort of hesitation from the organization to potentially play him in this given week, then we'll play Mike Williams here. Otherwise, Joshua Palmer is a fantastic play coming off of the last 5 weeks of 12, 8, 10, 10, and 7 targets. This last week, 5 receptions, 56 yards. Wasn't the greatest overall performance within a given week, but quite frankly, we're not bothered by it. If we're going to get ourselves 8 fantasy points from Josh Palmer, but also have the potential of a 100-yard, 2-touchdown receiving game in the absence of Mike Williams, then we will obviously want to start him up. We know that there's a lot of upside, and even though this last week, the touchdown upside went to Keenan Allen and DeAndre Carter, those are guys that aren't really known for being touchdown receiving machines. So we could very easily see those numbers pivot right back in the direction of Josh Palmer going into this given matchup against the Las Vegas Raiders defense, which we know is one of the worst secondaries in the National Football League and one of the worst defenses in terms of stopping the pass. Whether it's to the opposing wide receiver or opposing tight end position, we've seen a lot of success. Like I talked about with Keenan Allen earlier, Justin Herbert has lost the dependency of having to throw to Keenan Allen and Mike Williams. He's learned to throw the ball to Josh Palmer and DeAndre Carter, and is doing it at a comfortable rate. So at this current moment in time, firing up Palmer. Moving on to Zay Jones, our number 27. He was one of the top options in terms of a waiver wire pickup going into this week, mainly because the last 2 weeks he has played, he has had himself 24 total targets in this offense. And we know that Trevor Lawrence trusts him because in the game-winning play on a 2-point conversion, he looked in the direction of Zay Jones and they completed the pass and they won the game. So at this current moment in time, I'm thinking to myself, well, Zay Jones has the Detroit Lions. It's one of the most advantageous matchups at the position. Not to mention the fact that we saw Diggs, 8 catches, 77 and a touchdown. Slayton, 5 catches, 86. Lazard, 4 catches, 87 and a touchdown. Waddle, 8 for 106 and 2 touchdowns. Tyreek Hill in that same game, 12 for 188. With Zay Jones primarily playing as an outside wide receiver, whether it is on the outside or on the inside, wide receivers dominate up against this defense. I'm expecting Zay Jones, who's coming off of a week and playing 91% of the offensive snaps, to not leave the field and dominate once again. Moving on to Jakobi Meyers at number 28. Even though he does play on Thursday, he's currently questionable to even play, considering he's dealing with a shoulder injury. If he does end up suiting up, going up against the Buffalo Bills could be one of the most advantageous matchups he could see in the recent future. Again, Amon-Ra St. recently, another slot wide receiver, had himself 9 catches, 122 and a touchdown up against this defense just last week. Amari Cooper, 8 catches, 113, 2 touchdowns. Justin Jefferson, 10 catches, 193 and a touchdown. Even Garrett Wilson, 8 catches for 92. Jakobi Meyers, if active, we know that he's one of Mac Jones' favorite wide receiver options on a weekly basis. Hopefully he's ready to go, because even prior to his injury, having only played 29% of the offensive snaps, played specifically 16 of the 55 snaps in that game. In those 16 snaps, already had 4 targets. He's being targeted 25% of the routes that he was running. So hopefully we're back in a conversation where Jakobi Meyers is healthy and ready to go in this matchup. Moving on to Treylon Burks at number 29. Even though the first touchdown of Treylon Burks' career is going to technically be a fumble recovered for a touchdown, it's a memorable moment nonetheless. Going into this week, I'm expecting Treylon Burks to have himself another one of these, better performances, probably 10 fantasy points in that realm of possibility. Whether or not he scores a touchdown, obviously is going to be rare considering the offense that he's associated with and the defense that they're specifically taking on. But recently, wide receivers have dominated up against his defense. Pittman, 6 catches for 75. McLaurin, 8 catches for 128. Even Christian Watson this last week, 4 catches, 110 and a touchdown. Treylon Burks has that potential as a rookie wide receiver to make a play after the catch and potentially fulfill deep receiving targets. Again, amongst all the receivers in this offense last week, Treylon Burks had the most overall yardage, but they all had 6 targets within this offense. It's just a matter of the average depth of target that Treylon Burks sees in comparison that elevates him in comparison to these other options going forward as the primary number 1 of the Tennessee Titans offense. Moving on. Let's talk about Courtland Sutton. Courtland Sutton in the last couple of weeks has finished, I think, at the number 34, the number 27, and the number 30 overall wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format. He's in that conversation of just getting himself enough fantasy points with 9.6, 10.5, and 10.5 to just be a decent wide receiver option. We're not going to find ourselves ultimate upside unless he finds the end zone, which he certainly could have. I mean, the amount of touchdowns that Russell Wilson threw this last weekend that were called back due to penalties is unbelievable. But nonetheless, I think Courtland Sutton can definitely find himself a lot of success. Now, he does take on the Baltimore Ravens. We'll most likely see Marlon Humphreys, which may be difficult. And if, in fact, Russell Wilson begins to fall apart, he may look back in the direction of someone like Kendall Hinton, which, again, could be a decent option in this given week for those of you who play in a full PPR. Could definitely get you 10 fantasy points as well as Courtland Sutton. But for right now, he's a decent option as a number 30. Moving on to Adam Thielen, who finally came out of the woodwork this last week, found himself 9 receptions, 61 yards, and a touchdown. Now, I don't know if that was the rivalry between him and, Bill Belichick that elevated his overall play, but Adam Thielen, hopefully, with the fact that we have Justin Jefferson on the opposite side of the field pulling coverage from Sauce Gardner, is going to get himself more targets and is going to get him more implemented in this offense. 10 targets this season from last week's game against the New England Patriots was the most targets he has seen all season long. And quite frankly, it's the most targets we've seen Adam Thielen garner from Kirk Cousins in quite some time. So if we're going to be in a conversation where he's going to get back into being the number 2 option within this offense against the defense that, of course, has great coverage, has a great run-stopping defense, we could get back into the conversation of Adam Thielen being a relevant fantasy option and hopefully putting up some fantasy points for us this week. Moving on, let's talk about Darius Slayton. Darius Slayton has been consistent. And even though when we're talking about consistency within the offense, Richie James Jr. has put up a touchdown in each of the last 2 games, which could be an intriguing option for those of you who are in a deeper league. As of right now, the fact that Darius Slayton continues to be in this conversation of being the primary number 1 wide receiver in terms of targets, will be the number 1 outside guy going up against the Washington Commanders. Yes, it has been a tougher matchup over the course of the last couple weeks, but as long as the weather is perfectly fine this week, I'm expecting him to be a 10-point potential player because that is what he has demonstrated over the last, 5-6 weeks now, and will consistently be in that ballpark unless, of course, the matchup is too difficult. I don't think that's going to be the case this week going up against Washington. Moving on, let's talk about Deebo Samuel. Deebo Samuel is dealing with a quad injury and a hamstring injury. Was limited to practice, even though he did end up playing 79% of the offensive snaps on Sunday going up against the New Orleans Saints. I'm still a little bit worried about him because he did have himself a little bit of a scare in that game in which obviously the medical crew had to check him out. He didn't go into the blue medical tent, but if we're going to be in a situation where Deebo Samuel has any realm of possibility of re-injuring himself, re-aggravating the hamstring, and leaving the game, it's not worth the play. So we'll keep that monitored as the week progresses. Could end up going higher in my rankings for sure. Speaking of another player that is dealing with injury and or illness, JuJu Smith-Schuster is coming off of a week in which he only played 29 of the 76 total offensive snaps for this team. Obviously, only 3 targets, 3 receptions, 38 yards. Had to do with the fact that he was limited, but he was coming off the concussion. We're still in a conversation where he's dealing with an illness, and if in fact that illness is going to hold him out, similar to the way that we saw other wide receivers earlier this season, whether it's been A.J. Brown, Davante Adams, guys who deal with illness throughout an entire week, show up on Sunday and aren't really themselves. So if we're going to be in a conversation where that's going to be the case, JuJu Smith-Schuster may not be an automatic play, even though this is going to be a pass-heavy team going up against the Cincinnati Bengals offense, which, of course, both these teams typically score high numbers up against one another. Moving on to DeVante Parker. Another one of these sleeper options that I wanted to mention at the end of this conversation. DeVante Parker, in his career, going up against the Buffalo Bills, has found an unbelievable amount of success. Obviously, in the games where he is left early due to an injury, they haven't been great, but in the rest of the games throughout his career, I'm just going to go ahead and read the fantasy point production, specifically up against Tre'Davious White, who again is going to be there, and available going up against him this week on Thursday. 12.5, 13.8, 15.1, 14.0, 17.0, 12.3, 11.3, 9.4, and 16.5. Those are his fantasy point contributions up against his defense. Mac Jones, And this offense, up against one of the better wide receiver matchups in the given week, I think DeVante Parker is certainly a play going into Thursday night. The final option I wanted to mention is another veteran wide receiver. It is Corey Davis. Corey Davis played 68.25% of the offensive snaps coming off the injury. If, in fact, they're not going to expand more of the role that we see from Elijah Moore, Corey Davis should be on the field more often, which should garner him more targets. And, of course, especially up against the Minnesota Vikings defense, which everyone will be focused on stopping, Garrett Wilson will open up more opportunity for Corey Davis to be a viable option within the given matchup. I think he's definitely a guy that you can go ahead, pick up off waivers, and potentially play in this given week in a half full PPR that could get a lot of targets going in his direction from Mike White in a pass-heavy game script. All right. Thank you, everybody, for watching. That's going to cover it for us today in terms of our Week 13 wide receiver rankings. That was a pretty long video, but either way, if you guys enjoyed today's content, be sure to click the like button down below. Subscribe if you have not yet already. And until tomorrow, we'll be talking about rest of season strength of schedule up into Thursday night's game. After Thursday night's game, we'll be live streaming here on the channel answering questions. So be sure to subscribe, tune in, click the bell notification button down below. Check out Prize Picks. I did mention a couple picks, whether it was regarding Christian Watson, Garrett Wilson, guys like even Christian Kirk, Jaylen Waddle, that have fantastic potential entries, picking more on their given numbers. So be sure to check out Prize Picks. There's a link down in the description of the video. Make sure to use promo code Andrew, because when you make that first-time deposit, your first-time deposit is immediately doubled up to $100. So check that out today. And until tomorrow, guys, I'll see you guys. Peace.